very warm welcome to this week's seminar. It is a huge pleasure to have Hartley Dean visiting us, coming back into the department to present some of his recent research. Hartley is, of course, known to most in the audience. He had been a professor in the department for a very long time. He is now an emeritus professor in the department. Hartley taught extensively and researched extensively social rights and has a very sound understanding of reciprocity. And he explained that he felt he had to do something for his emeritus status and should really present the research he's doing to us. And so it's great that he is with us. Before joining academia, Hartley worked for 12 years as a community-based welfare rights worker. And I think it's probably fair to say that this working at the street level very much shaped his research and also his teaching, focusing on welfare dependency, indeed the myth of welfare dependency, looking at social rights, human needs. And he has established a very, very distinguished record of research on all of these issues. Those who don't know Hartley because they were in the department when he taught with us probably should know him nonetheless from the reading lists in many courses. So, for instance, those in understanding social advantage are very familiar with his recent edited book volume together with Lucinda on social advantage and disadvantage, or those who took our core courses, his work on social rights and human welfare, understanding human needs. So even though he is physically gone in terms of classroom teacher, I think he's still very much with us in the teaching on a near weekly basis. His work as a community based welfare rights activist, almost, I wonder, we talk a lot about street level bureaucrats, and I wondered how to describe Hartley's work at the street level, and whether, well, maybe not so much bureaucrat, but quite possibly street level fighter, which then informed the research he did for so many years. And it's great that we now have the opportunity to listen to some of his more recent research, where he approaches altruism critically and looks at it in the context of emerging welfare states. But enough from me, and I would like to hand over to Hartley and thank him very much for coming back in the department today.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Timo. Okay, it feels rather strange, but good at the same time to be back in this place. This is obviously an unusual sort of format, a sort of hybrid in personal presentation, but with the chair sitting remotely somewhere out there in the.
I'm going to have lunch while listening. Or are you about to have lunch?
Right. Okay. As Timo explained, I felt that sitting around with emeritus status, I should be sharing something with the department about the things that I'm doing. So what I'm about to give is very much a think piece. Although he talks about research, I have been doing nothing in terms of the sort of empirical research, but I have been doing quite a lot of thinking. And the ideas in this particular paper are one of the things that I've been working on in the last couple of years. I'm sitting down. I'm not sure whether it would just seem too didactic if I were to stand up. I mean, this seems to really be the rather. Shall I stay sitting down? No, stand up. Okay. Head of department says stand up. I shall stand. It may flow better, I don't know. We'll see how that works. Okay, so Wellbeing and Do-gooding, we're really looking at issues around individual altruism versus human sociality. And what this is actually a stripped down presentation of a forthcoming article, which I'm actually working on or revising at the moment, ready for publication. I'll also be giving a paper at the SVA conference this year, virtually, it should be said, with a similar version of this particular paper. So this is, for me, a practice run, because I am out of practice with this stuff now. So I need the practice. I thought I'd do it in front of what I hope is a sort of friendly audience. So treat me tentatively. So, introduction. To start talking about altruism, many of you will recognize the extent to which this is a topic with quite a lot of LSE connections. Classically, we tend to think, following Richard Titmuss, that the welfare state can be seen as a sort of manifestation of a form of institutionalized altruism. And other people from social policy, thinking particularly of Robert Pinker, for example, also took up that idea and to talk about the role of altruism in terms of the institution of welfare states. And there's a very clear sense in which altruism is relevant to the motivations of policymakers themselves. It's relevant to the maintenance of a public service ethos in the delivery of services and benefits and so forth. And Julian isn't here, but Julian Legrand has had a lot to say about those sorts of issues as well. But also the whole issue of public support for state spending on welfare services. It's clearly the question of altruism, and an awful lot of research based on social values and social attitudes has spoken to those issues, and some of that has emanated from this institution. But what I'm wanting to argue is that it's not altruism, but what we may call sociality, our fundamental social interdependence that is axiomatic when we are talking about the promotion of human well-being. And so the argument here is going to be resolved around three concepts. It's going to be very much a conceptual sort of presentation. Yes, I'll talk about altruism. More controversially, I want to talk about concepts of fetishism, and then indeed to sociality. So this is going to be conceptually a bit of a roller coaster. So I hope you'll bear with me, but indulge me, as I say. Now, a few words about various contemporary understandings of altruism. So would anyone here know Robert Page and some of the work that he did back in the 1990s on altruism? Well, a book called Altruism and the British Welfare State. He presents a sort of continuum, five-stop continuum between pure selfishness and pure selflessness at the other end. And the idea is that in between those positions, those mentalities, those forms of motivation, there is self-interest, there is reciprocity, and then moving towards altruism, notions of other-oriented action before you get to something that is purely altruistic. And the question is, does this inform us about the way that people actually behave? And to what extent are the compromises that have been implicated in the way that we have constructed welfare states reflected on those sort of continua? So if we turn to psychologists, they have looked at the notion of, is there such a thing as an altruistic personality? And the conclusion by and large is there is no such thing as a altruistic personality. Sober and Wilson in particular, important social psychologists, suggest that we are all of us motivational pluralists. None of us, as it were, sit at one point along that continuum. We can be different from day to day. We will vary, we will, depending on the circumstances. So psychologists have had stuff to say, but more fundamentally, what about the biologists? And key debate within that sphere of science, because it all started, of course, with Charles Darwin, concerned with the way in which the human species has developed and the extent to which there may be genes which account for the way that some people will behave in an altruistic manner, whereas maybe others don't. And certainly Darwin did argue in favor of the idea that there is some advantage to particular groups in society which adopt altruistic standards of behavior. And so that can account for the way in which societies perhaps develop, as well as us as living organisms. But a very different view, as some of you may know, came from Richard Dawkins, who talked about the idea of the selfish gene. He said the altruistic gene or group of genes or whatever it is, if they exist, and no one's actually identified a gene for altruism or a group, but if there is, it will be completely out-competed by the selfish gene. That is the whole point of it. So Dawkins was very clear that altruism isn't natural, it cannot be biologically explained in that sense. But interestingly, both Darwin and Dawkins could sort of agree that what Darwin referred to as our sympathetic social instincts, but what Dawkins would refer to as altruistic behavioral memories, things which some people demonstrate and then sort of share around. These are things which can be culturally transmitted. And it's that notion of cultural transmission which becomes important for elements of the argument that I'm coming to. But where did the concept actually come from? And it's widely assumed to have come from one Auguste Comte. This is his gravestone. Early 19th century figure, widely regarded as the father of positivist sociology. And some of you may even have read his work, I'm not sure. But little less known is the fact that he was also the founder of a sort of secular religion, the religion of humanism. Have people heard of that? A few nods around. I was quite fascinated to actually just discover this, the religion of humanity. And just quite quickly look at Comte's essential sort of arguments. Quick summary. He suggested that there have been three eras in our social evolution as a species. So it began in a pre-Enlightenment era with a theological era, which was an era of a paternalistic social order, informed very much by irrational beliefs, by religious beliefs. But come the European Enlightenment in particular, we saw the emergence of what he called a metaphysical era, dominated by liberal philosophy, which was very individualistic in nature and very fundamentally selfish, utilitarian selfish individualism. But what Comte looked forward to in the future was a new positive or positivist era, in which this would be an era of wise governance, all informed by his notion of sociology. And his notion of sociology was a kind of systematically analytical social physics. He used the notion of, it's like physics, but just to do with society rather than material things. But when it came to this invention later in his life of a religion, a secular non-theistic religion, aptly perhaps explained as sort of Catholicism without Christianity, sort of trying to define what it was that he wanted from it. But this was a real religion. They could have church buildings, they had priests, they had sacraments, and I'll come back to this in a minute or two. But it was essentially a very conservative project. Because what Comte sought to do through this non-religious church or secular church was to subjectivize a sort of altruistic social order within which, it should be said, social inequalities would be preserved, as long as they were functional. Functional social inequalities were okay, they would indeed be preserved. And the motto for this religion was order and progress. Now, you can imagine that Comte's body of work was dismissed equally on both left and right. Marx rejected it, the neoliberal right rejected it, but has had some strange resonances within the sort of social liberal circles and in certain countries. If we're talking about social liberals, an interesting aside, one of the religion of humanity's most ardent supporters was someone called Henry Beveridge. He was a district judge in India in the imperial era. And he was the father of William Beveridge, who was, of course, allegedly the founder or the architect of the British welfare state and a former director of the LSE. But so he was William's father, and he was also father-in-law to Richard Tawney, well-known social liberal philosopher. Now, whether or not there was any, as it were, direct influence between, Comte via Henry to these other, we really don't know. There's nothing to actually demonstrate that, but it's an interesting little fact to chuck in for amusement. But it's also been an influence in various other countries. So for a while, certainly in Comte's native France, but also very seriously in Brazil. And that motto, order and progress, actually appears on the Brazilian national flag. We still have some church buildings in Brazil. So this can bring us not to positivism, but to perhaps a discussion of fetishism. I'll try and explain why this is relevant to the argument I'm developing. Now, the originator of the term fetishism and the notion of the fetish goes back to Charles de Brosse in the 18th century. He was an unusual man. He wasn't classically educated. He was an autodidact, very productive and engaged in very sophisticated forms of argument and research. And he undertook a seminal study of fetish gods in West Africa. And his notion of the fetish and of fetishism and the symbolism associated with it all stemmed from his quite sophisticated analysis. And since de Brosse, fetishism has become very elastic term. It can potentially be extended to symbolic objects, to cultural constructs, to moral ideals. But these things, these fetishes, can obscure or distort the perception of human relationships in a variety of ways. And this mechanism, if you like, associated with the fetish and fetishism, is implicated in various unseen mechanisms of cultural transmission. Back to that point about the agreement between Dawkins and Darwin on cultural transmission. The fetish is perhaps a way in which that actually happens. And the term fetishism was actually adopted by Auguste Comte, and particularly when he was referring to that first era in social development, as it were, when he was talking about the deist theologies. This was an immature form of fetishism as far as Comte was concerned. And what he was interested in his non-theistic religion of humanity, he actually referred to as a grand fetiche. This was, as it were, the alternative, mature form of fetish and fetishism, because it would do what he wanted to do in terms of cultural transmission. Now, the concept of the fetish and fetishism has sort of fallen in and out of fashion all over the place. It's been sometimes important, sometimes rejected in anthropology, in philosophy, in psychoanalysis, and in political economy. But one way of seeing this and making sense of it is to actually consider some of the applications of fetishism as a concept when it comes to altruistic and explanations for altruistic conduct. There's a whole set of applications. Some of these applications relate to magic and to magical influences. So beliefs in pre-modern societies. I'll be coming back to talking about it a bit more detail in just a moment, but fundamentally, this entails issues about the relationship between gift giving on the one hand and human survival on the other, and how those things are mediated, as it were. We only come to religion and religious ordinances, the relationship between, if you like, good deeds and salvation or redemption. Then philosophical ideals similarly can be viewed from this perspective, looking at the mediation between virtue on the one hand and fulfillment on the other. And then, of course, we have got psychoanalytical interpretations where fetishism is associated with the displacement or sublimation of innate desires. I'm not going to be talking about those, but in many ways, of course, in the popular imagination, that is what they associated the term of fetishism with, which means when we talk to students, they tend to sort of giggle and don't actually get to the point. There is rather a serious concept underlying this, but it is actually being used in a variety of ways. But just going back to magic, first of all, and in particular, the work of Marcel Mauss. Mauss himself disliked the term fetishism, but nonetheless, his extensive work in terms of drawing upon anthropological evidence from a variety of sources showed how certain behaviors had concerned with gift giving had fundamental significance for the way in which societies were actually moderated, the way in which social cohesion was maintained, the way in which goods could be distributed. But it was less about the distribution of goods so much as the advancement of social cohesion in pre-modern tribal societies. The point being for Mauss was that gifts obtained a magical quality. A gift given actually retained a magic. It was be magically seeking its way back to its originator, or indeed to the forest from which it first came, or whatever. And in the process of recirculation of gifts, they actually established the mechanisms which bound societies together and made them functional. But it was belief in magic, and gifts could be dangerous things to actually see. If you didn't treat them properly, you might die, or you get a terrible disease. There was strange magical beliefs associated with gift giving and the whole circulation of gifts within society. Moving down to religious ordinances, it's significant that, of course, we know all the world's major religions draw distinctions between the transcendent and the worldly, and they all subscribe to some version of a divinely ordained golden rule. The golden rule being, do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. But this is a rule handed down by God. And when it comes to the, the sort of Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they all have notions of versions of tithing and the giving of alms. It's all central to those religions in different ways, and I've written about this before. I'm not going to turn this into a lecture about those sorts of things. The other thing to say about fetishism and religions, apart from the obvious thing that this was something which was ordained for you, this is what you must actually do, the way of understanding it, which wasn't based necessarily on rational argument, is Feuerbach's critique of Christianity and the concept of projection. Because as a disciple of Hegel, Feuerbach moved the philosophical argument on to actually say, well, to what extent can we understand Christianity as an attempt to project onto a God what we might regard as the better nature of our own humanity? And that is what we do. So by implication, although once again, Feuerbach wasn't using the language of fetishism. What he described is a fetishistic, actually, understanding of how Christianity in particular worked, and to say, this is why I must behave in this way. I said I would come back to philosophical ideals. Don't want to do a philosophical lecture, but very quickly, thinking of some key philosophical thinkers. The abstract construction of virtue ethics, going back to sort of Aristotle, the notion of objective spiritual consciousness to be found in Hegel. And if you think of Kant in particular here, who made this distinction between perfect and imperfect duties, between duties which were logical, which were categorical, as it were, as opposed to duties that were simply morally desirable. And Kant himself actually considered that religious observance, he was skeptical of religion in some ways, but he said religion is a jolly good thing because it has a pedagogic function, because it actually serves as a way of promoting morally desirable duties, even if philosophically, I wouldn't necessarily accept that they are obsolete, categorical, logical. I'm skipping the psychoanalytical, but obviously there's also notions of fetishism in political economy, and I'm going to come back to those. But I want to say first, I warned you, roller coaster. The big leap is to talk a little bit about this concept of sociality, which is somewhat elusive in some ways. And did it actually have an originator? Well, Axel Honneth suggests that it was this guy that was the first to actually use the concept of sociality. This is Hugo Grotius. He looks a little bit like Edmund Blackadder in the picture, but actually he was a Dutch lawyer who was very interested in the concept of natural law. And it was in that connection that he argued that human nature is constituted by the intersection of two competing drives. Self-preservation on the one hand and sociality on the other. And his argument was that our individual survival as individuals, and our social connectedness are totally interdependent. Now, Axel Honneth argues that in many ways that term sociality didn't catch on, or was in many ways just overtaken by the development of the socialist movement and of socialism, and was somehow sort of buried and lost as a result of that. But you can see from what I've just said, that summary, that Grotius' sort of concept of sociality has resonances all over. If you think of philosophers like Venus, the whole concept of intersubjectivity, which arose in the 20th century, the idea that our selfhood stems from our relationships with others and can't be distinguished from that. And most recently, another social psychologist, Michael Tomasello, has been advancing the concept of ontogenetic sociality. Tomasello's work is concerned with the development of sociocultural activity in humans and their capacity in particular for pro-social behaviors. And that's research both on children and some research also on adults. But social psychologists adopting this notion of sociality in that particular context. And before moving on, it's worth mentioning, so far I've been showing you pictures of white men. There are all sorts of relevance and resonance notions which can be drawn from various other sources. So for example, Ubuntu. Ubuntu is Pan-African philosophy. I'm not quite sure how ancient it is, but there's sort of classic adage in Ubuntu philosophy is a person is a person through other persons. Similarly, if we consider Hannah Arendt and her classic critique of totalitarian societies, in her book, The Human Condition, a life not lived among other humans is not a human life. So these are very comprehensible adages that sort of capture something about that notion of sociality that I'm trying to build. How are we doing for time? Right. That brings us to Marx, inevitably. Another gravestone, I'm afraid. Karl Marx isn't normally sort of painted as a particularly avuncular figure. And I'm being a little bit mischievous here, but the point is that Marx's revolutionary goals were underpinned by a radical humanist philosophy. And much of his work that points to this, although it is realized and informed later work, didn't really reach a wide audience until the 1930s, when some of the work was actually translated into English, by which time the sort of Leninist take on Marx had locked into the public imagination. Marx drew certainly on a range of sources. And more recently, people like Agnes Heller and Georgi Marcus, in particular, have been trying to interpret some of the early philosophical and anthropological writings, the way that they are reflected in Marx's later work. And it's clear that Marx drew, for example, on Aristotle, the human being is uniquely a zoon politikon. The point being that actually that Greek phrase, the politikon, can refer to this social as well as the political dimension of the human animal. And Marx's clear understanding was that the implication of this is that human beings have needs. This is my interest in human need, which are radical in the sense that these are the things, these are the characteristics that must be realized in the human beings, in a human's life, that distinguish human beings from other species. To be human, you must be able to have these characteristics. So sociality is in fact one of those four constitutive needs, characteristics which define our species being. Now, I'm going to apologize, first of all, because some of you will have heard me start this particular stuff before, and I apologize because I'm going to do it with some haste because of that. But if we're to understand sociality as a constitutive human need, sociality is, I've indicated already, to do with social interdependence. But if we expand that concept a bit, this implies, from what I've been saying, I hope, sociality entails an awareness of self through others. So that can be at different levels. So it's concerned with love in self-affirming intimate relationships. It's concerned with solidarity and cooperation within human communities. And for example, between generations within human society. And it entails universal recognition of mutual needs and claims between strangers, including distant strangers. But that very importantly articulates this particular constitutive need we need as human beings to be social, is linked to other things which are essential needs. Our consciousness, our cognitive awareness, which is distinctive in the human species. Work, the distinctiveness of human beings, what Marx refers to as our metabolism with nature, the way in which we engage with the world, if you like, our sort of purposeful activity, our creativity, and historical development. Human beings make their own history. Other species do not. And for Marx and for people like Marcus in particular, that instills from this in the way that I've been trying to develop the idea, you can see how fundamentally interdependent those constitutive characteristics are, particularly the link between consciousness and sociality. You can actually understand that. but also, of course, consciousness and sociality feeding into work, what it is that human beings do. And then those connections between work, what our impact on what we do, including the terrible things that have been done to the planet, not to anything else, and historical development, the whole idea that as human beings, we are engaged in processes of collective self-determination. So that is indecently quick, but if we're actually now going to reflect on its relevance for social policy and the relevance of fetishism in the argument that I'm trying to actually develop. This is the point at which it becomes perhaps evident. Now, fundamental to sort of Marx's critique is a critique not just of capitalism, but of previously existing modes of production, as the human species was developing, as it were, to the extent which all human societies have dehumanized some of their members. There is a denial of their sociality. So sociality is fundamentally negated through relations of power, through violence, through systemic disadvantage and inequalities. It is the alienation of human beings, and Marx's concept of alienation is essentially sort of grounded in this kind of understanding, the alienation of human beings from the essence of their humanness. And by essence here, we are not talking about some spiritual essence in the way that Hegel would have, but fundamentally a constitutive material in that sense. This is what defines what human beings are. This is the argument. And once again, in his critique of Hegel, Marx was arguing that the substantive realities of human being and human activity become sublated, it's his term, into phantom objectivities. The point is, if you consider an institution, fundamental social institution like the state, including the welfare state, it appears to have an autonomy that is removed from subjective everyday experience. It has that remoteness that you can actually understand it as not necessarily being magic in that way, not necessarily divinely ordained, but somehow it appears to have something that is unrelated to everyday experience. And famously, of course, everyone is aware of Marx's concept of commodity fetishism, the idea that we in capitalist society create material relations between persons and social relations between things. The idea of the market as an invisible autonomous force. So Marx was actually reading political economy critically. So just as Adam Smith would recognize that statement, Marx comes at it in a different way. And it is, if you like, the fetishized ideal of individual sovereignty and independence that lies at the heart of this, because that entails the denial of human interdependency, while it can nevertheless celebrate the freedom of the individual to be altruistic. It can embrace those things together. And this is an important thought for me. Timo kindly mentioned in his introduction my work on dependency culture 30 odd years ago, which is scary. But in dependency culture, I argue for a concept of dependency fetishism. And I was trying to capture something there, which I'm trying to recapture here, because I think I was mistaken in what I was then actually arguing. The fetish, of course, in this instance, if you're considering about how it is that we stigmatize welfare dependency and the receipt of welfare benefits and services. The fetish here, of course, is the moral ideal of individual independence. The fetish is not the dependency, it is the other way around. I've captured an idea that I hadn't really articulated. So it is the denial, the obscuring of human interdependence that is at the heart of the dependency culture that one was attacking there, the whole business of welfare stigmatization. More at some time. Coming to some sort of a conclusion. Okay, So what we can do is say, well, altruism in its various guises, with arguing can function as a fetishized mediation of essential human sociality. It's not that it's totally different. Altruism can be an expression of human sociality. So the individual acts of do-gooding are not to be condemned and self-sacrifice. There's some amazing literature. Kirsten Monroe did some research on some extraordinary heroes, ordinary people who did amazingly heroic things. He did some in-depth interviews there. And tried to get from that, because all these people denied that they were heroes. It's just what you've got to do. And they were, in a sense, capturing something fundamental about sociality, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this meant that we have a sense of collective acceptance, recognition of human interdependency. We know from a range of research, the UK citizen survey from the early 2000s demonstrated the extent to which most people are willing to support good causes. We're all against sin, and but that's doesn't necessarily mean an acceptance or a recognition of fundamental human interdependency. But such an acceptance would require a shift of consciousness, a sort of gestalt switch in perception. It is a switch of perception that is entailed in seeing the argument in this way. It's taken me a long time. That sort of analysis. But the extent to which we can transcend fetishized or illusory appearance on the basis on which everyday well-being can be attained. So is this a utopian project, or simply a call for critical thinking, or perhaps critical reflection would be a better word there? That's going to sort of end. Going back to Darwin for a moment, incidentally, it was an interesting relationship between Marx and Darwin. They did correspond with each other briefly, and it appears there was a sort of respectful clash, as it were, between them. But it's also quite clear that actually Darwin didn't really accept anything that we might equate with a notion of sociality. I think it's much closer to the concept of altruism that he was speaking about, and certainly because he sided with Kant and not with Marx. But that's an aside. Here is this quotation from Darwin's book, The Descent of Man. As humanity advances in civilization and small tribes are united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell each individual that they ought to extend their social instincts and sympathies. Is that altruism or is that sociality? But I think it's altruism. Social instincts and sympathies to all the members of the same nation, though personally unknown to them. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent their sympathies extending to the persons of all nations and races. Now, the artificial barrier, what exactly might that be? So is this injunction, as it were, about extending individual altruism? Is it about fully realizing our sociality? And that's the point which I discuss, if you will. And feel free to relate all of that to your own concerns in social policy, as I'm struggling to persuade journal editors at the moment its relevance to social policy. But for me, it is.
Thank you very much, Hartley. If someone could turn the camera so the Zoom people can see the room, and if we switch Zoom in the room to exactly so that the crowd can be seen there too. Brilliant. Next one, the camera, so that we see the crowd. But in the meantime, Stephen has his hand up, so we have the first person from the virtual world. Stephen, please.
Hi, Hartley. Thanks very much. Sorry I can't be there in person today. Really interesting. I had a couple of related questions about your question about the relationship to the welfare, social policy and the welfare state. And the first thing I was wondering was, I mean, you've described altruism, fetishism, and sociality, which are related to individual motivations. And I've been trying to think about the extent to which you really are trying to push these as complements or substitute ways of thinking. So that's the first question, of which you could perhaps clear me up on that one. And the second one is going from relating individual motivations to society as a whole, and hence social policy and social policy actions. I guess maybe coming from an economist background, part of the reason a lot of social policy exists through governments and others is because of the need for collective actions. And I'd quite like you to elaborate, if you could, about the relationship between the sort of things that you've been talking about, which I see as describing sources of individual motivations, to the collective actions that societies might have to do in order to meet social needs more generally. I don't know if that makes any sense, but anyway, thanks very much.
Okay, I'll respond one at a time. Okay, the relationship between sort of different interpretations of motivation. In this context, you're saying, are they complementary or are they a substitute? I think in reality, they may complement, but if there is an objective, the fundamental need is to actually create that switch. My argument about the fetishized nature of altruistic injunctions in particular is that they obscure the fundamental nature of our interdependency. And I am arguing that that is something that needs, in fact, to be transcended. So you can look at a range of altruistic behaviors and say, yes, that is something we would not want to stop, it is something we would like to encourage, but there's something more to be said, particularly at more fundamental levels. So when it comes to issues of collective actions, it's kind of switch, if you like, from individual do-gooding to that notion of collective doing that then brings you into sort of wider issues between, and in much of my other work, if people have seen it, I sort of have argued for the notion of a needs-first ethos, that rather than a mindset which is concerned with the creation of value, what's in it for me, I could potentially benefit by paying my taxes. The world would be a better place, and so that'd be fair enough for me. But the fundamental sense of not doing good, but of that we are part of a collective process of doing. That is what humanity and human progress entails, which means going back to those fundamental characteristics of our species being and of the realization of those needs and of the needs-first ethos. So that, yes, if one thinks about provision of care, if one thinks about the distribution of resources, food, energy, housing, whatever, if you think about personal development through sort of education, way in which we are socialized as interdependent beings, one thinks about forms of political activity and engagement, the extent to which human beings can be a part of history making as humans. And if we think of the injustices of this world as something to do with the dehumanization, so that the object of social policies is that of humanization. So it is that question of perspective and perception, that shift. I don't know to what extent that meets your reservations. I don't know how our chair isn't in the room.
We have Tanya. I mean, is there a hand going up in the room? I couldn't see. I think Tanya was first and then Johan in the back.
I'm actually outside, so I hope people can hear me okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. thank you very much, Hartley. That was very refreshing. It's lovely to have some really fundamental thinking brought before us. I had two comments I wanted to make. One is a sort of example, I guess, and the other was a worry about Marx. So the example first was the early stages of the pandemic. And I was very struck by how the enforced separation and, if you like, individualization of the lockdown, separating everybody into their own little boxes in their own houses and flats and so on, seemed to produce a strong opposite reaction amongst many people towards mutuality and collectivism. And I thought that was a really striking instance of how fundamental this concept of sociality that you've been talking about is to people's sense of themselves, their daily lives, what they feel they need to do to exist, almost. And the kind of springing up of mutual associations, which Anne Power and colleagues have studied, was a really marked feature, particularly of those first early days of the pandemic. And then my worry about Marx is that part where, as you were presenting today, he's talking about sociality as one of the four kind of constituent elements of what it is to be human, and then his critique of capitalism and other forms of social organization that undermine that possibility and deprive people of sociality through alienation or persistent disadvantage and so on. And that's a bit worrying, isn't it? Because if it's actually constitutive of what it is to be human, that you are social, and you're deprived that, then you actually become subhuman. And as we know, when societies start classifying some groups of people as subhuman, really horrific things follow. So how do we square this idea that Marx thinks that sociality is actually constitutive of what it is to be human, with his remarks about that being denied to certain sections of the population? Does that make them not human? Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tanya. Yes, did we see evidence of sociality, the emergence, the realization of sociality during the pandemic? I think that's an interesting one. I mean, the clapping for carers and various other things which were instigated. My sense is that what one can worry about, particularly in the current sort of political era, the rise of populism and so on, and some of the consequences of changes in welfare provision have pushed us in directions back to an expression of sociality through charity. So we have the rise of food banks, crowdfunding for operations which wouldn't otherwise happen. And yes, these demonstrations of solidarity, some of which I would have to say, I mean, I hope I'm not seeing unduly cynical about it, to be quite synthetic and fragile expressions of solidarity and concern. So you can see individual responses, which you can clearly identify as altruistic, and it's not as if one would ever want to discourage those, but how enduring, how effective are these? Some time ago, I also picked up the notion of post-emotionalism, which has sort of developed to actually consider the way in which people be enthusiastically opposed to hunger on the other side of the world by attending rock concerts, by giving money to deserving causes. People can do empathy and sympathy at a rather synthetic sort of level, at the same time as insisting that the issue of their self-interest must enter into the equation. So I wasn't necessarily convinced that clapping for carers demonstrated a great deal. You may say here is a transient demonstration of a sense of common humanity being expressed. But how convincing, how enduring is that without that switch in perception? On Marx, and more generally, the notion, several scholars are moving towards this notion of dehumanization as being central to, rather than thinking about disadvantage or about social injustice, which are, particularly the notion of social injustice, important as it is, it's a very abstract concept if you're bringing the notions of justice into it. If you talk about dehumanization, this is very substantial. It means that as a human being, you are being denied the opportunity to be fully human. Now, you may say that sounds scary because that doesn't mean that you cease to be human. You are a human, but your capacity to actually be human is being denied, frustrated, limited, constricted, which is why several scholars are now talking seriously about notions of dehumanization. I don't know if people have had a chance to read Fiona Williams' latest offering on social policy, radical rewrite of her introduction to social policy. But she's one of several people in social policy who are beginning to talk about a new humanism, whereas I've been talking about a radical humanism in other places. So once again, that may only be a partial answer to Tanya, but I'm doing my best.
And maybe now a double pack from Johan and Vicente.
Hi, Hartley. My name's Johan. We haven't met before. Pleasure to meet. Thank you very much for the talk today. My question's about trying to figure out how I would identify or probably distinguish an altruistic initiative from a social initiative. The impression I get from your remarks today is that they are initiatives leveled by different kinds of political unit, or for which the intended recipient of one's support is distinct according to different political units. In altruism, the political scope is quite narrow, kind of an easily changeable interpretation about the boundaries of the group to whom one is trying to be altruistic, as opposed to a social initiative, if I understand you right, is a much broader and a thicker political conception of the collective to whom one is obliged, so to speak. But if I'm right about that, then I'm trying to think, what would Mr. Hayek say if he were in the room today? Because Mr. Hayek would say that when my parents extend me a kindness, given that the family is the operative political unit of society more generally, they aren't just behaving altruistically, they are behaving in a way that is very consistent with what Hartley Dean today has said counts as a social initiative. So the question for you is, how do I distinguish between these two? And is it right to think of the distinction as a political commentary? How far does that take us? I hope that question makes sense.
Yes, I mean, you can certainly bring the ideological spectrum, as it were, to an extent into this debate if you're just putting altruism versus sociality. As if you're doing a kind of binary distinction sort of exercise. But you made another binary distinction, which I think is relevant between thin and thick, which I have used in a variety of contexts myself, particularly thinking about needs. And yes, I mean, Hayek would not have approved of certainly the analysis of Kant. We know that left and right rejected that approach, that understanding of individual altruism, because actually they celebrated individual selfishness. Hayek might, however, point to a social institution as family, and we could say, yes, we can consider what the individual motives of the family actors might actually be. But as an understanding of sociality, we can say, because I said the whole relevance of love and the way in which we are formed through intimate relationships is critically important. But they are not necessarily utilitarian calculations entailed in that. That may always be an element of it, but that would be, if that was an interpretation of that's good enough sociality, it's a very thin interpretation of what our sociality is, rather than a thicker, encompassing notion of sociality that embraces a species. And I'm beginning to lose my own thread here because that was a complicated question. But I sort of pointed to the themes in there, which, yes, actually spoke to what we're trying to say.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Nicky. Thanks for the really interesting presentation. I have one question, and it seems to me that the concept of sociality has been present maybe implicitly in other perspectives on the welfare state and social policy analysis. For instance, in the Polanyian tradition, reciprocity, redistribution were seen as a kind of complement, as a functional requirement of the functioning of the economy. In the early work of Ian Goff's on the political economy of the welfare state, I would say that the perspective was quite similar, but understood as a kind of necessity of capital accumulation, social policy as attached to the function of the economy, and maybe in a more contemporary version, views on social investment tend to have this notion of sociality at its base, but maybe implicitly. So I was wondering if the utility of this concept could be more related to maybe discovering or revealing a theoretical logic in welfare state analysis, or if the utility you've been trying to reach with this concept is to kind of create a new perspective or innovate in that sense.
I think what I'm attempting to do is to create awareness, at least, of an alternative perspective, that notion of the Gestalt switch. Actually turn that around and actually look at it in those terms. Because the idea that reciprocity, as is encouraged or indeed enforced by a welfare state, is functional. It is functional at one level for the individual, but not necessarily unequivocally or unambiguously so. Because of course the welfare state has a variety of control mechanisms built into it because of conditionality and all the rest of it. And the social investment sort of concept is saying, yes, let's invest in these things because in the long run, it's going to be better for all of us. It is a utilitarian calculus that actually underpins that conceptualization, rather than saying, let's put human need first and judge our approaches to the delivery of care, to the distribution of resources, etc., there's that concept of human need and what it is that constitutes our humanity, our shared humanity, and our dependence on interdependence. Is providing that alternative perspective, or at least if we can't switch to that as a guiding objective, to actually have that as an alternative way of evaluating policy and policy outcomes. I don't know if that helps.
And now Tony from the virtual world.
Oh, Tony,
Greetings from the virtual world. Thanks, Timo. It's a fascinating lens to look at modern divisions in society and inequality in society. Thank you for that, Hartley. And the appeal to sort of history as well, giving that sort of showing that there's some past to this to inform the present. You ended with throwing out a question from that Darwin quote about the artificial barriers that stand in the way of our universal sociality. That set me thinking that the barriers in Darwin's time were primarily geographic. People just didn't travel as much as Darwin did, and that's changed so substantially today. We're meeting virtually, and the artificial barriers are probably more fluid than they were, and perhaps in terms of what comes from this for social policy is that addressing those artificial barriers, there seem to be policy actors in the world who have an interest in creating those barriers, in generating new barriers to maintain positions, status, etc. But also the fluidity of this means that they break down. So I thought you were a bit dismissive of the clap for carers during COVID, because it may be transient, but is it not an opportunity to break down one of these artificial barriers and build a social norms? If we appealed today, you clap for carers last year, are you looking after your neighbours this year? There's an opportunity to build on that pride in being social. Same with Ukrainian refugees. I think the Ukrainian government have used social media brilliantly and have broken down barriers between people so that we feel they are the same as us. And so generating these new norms break down these artificial barriers that others are working to create for their own ends. So I thought maybe these things are transient, but also they are opportunities for policy. They're fluid in both directions.
Thanks. Yes, I take your point about sort of opportunities. Maybe we need to value those and celebrate them as they appear. But I mean, history suggests that they are rather sort of transitory moments. I think they rather clearly demonstrate that. But yes, the beginning of your question, the fact that human mobility, the shrinking of the world, communication, all of which does indeed provide opportunity for us to recognize the humanity of people on the other side of the planet, people living in quite different places. But to what extent does that actually bring the distant stranger any closer, if indeed our sociality is about recognizing mutual needs, about mutual claims? Because I think we've all, if we're talking about experiences during the pandemic, I don't know how you found, video conferencing, conversations on Zoom, and how real, how human that actually feels. Yes, we can do it, and it clearly has got a role, but I don't necessarily think it necessary, qualitatively entails the same thing, because it becomes an act of imagination, as it were, to be able to engage with someone who is not physically in your presence, rather than a fundamental awareness of our interdependency, our interconnection on that greater scale. So yes, let's approach the opportunities with perhaps, not undue skepticism, but considerable caution.
And we have Pupul also in the virtual space.
Andy Butler in the real space, where we're doing real interaction.
So I didn't pick up that when the microphone didn't quite catch it.
Hello.
Yes, whoever is covered in the corner. Now, yes. But first Pupul and then back into the room.
Yeah, thank you, Timo. Thank you, Hartley. You talked about the switch needed from altruism to sociality. And I was just wondering what mechanisms could there be? I mean, of course, you talked about the need for awareness. And I was just wondering whether enlightened self-interest could be one of the ways in which this switch could be contemplated. And I was also thinking of how Rousseau talked about the general will and how that is as a collection of enlightened self-interest of everyone in the society. So could that be one of the ways in which this can be envisaged? Thank you.
I think part of what I've been trying to refer, I mean, thank you for the question, because the notion of enlightened self-interest is classically, I think, a justification for exactly what we've been talking about when it comes to altruism. And I've been trying to say it's not to be sniffed at, because clearly that is part of what one would want to encourage if one is concerned to minimize social injustice, stroke dehumanization. But if the idea of a progressive mechanism is kind of difficult. If you take the analysis that I've been presenting about the nature of fetishized understandings or misunderstandings of essential humanity, which is the idea of a Gestalt switch. It's either on or off. That's why I'm using the term of switch, because you can sometimes have that flash of insight, flash of inspiration, which is kind of difficult to hold on to indefinitely. So I'm pointing to something that might seem to be rather elusive and impractical, which is why it's kind of hard for an empirically oriented academic community to actually say, how do I deal with a switch which can be turned on and off? And you can suddenly see the world upside down, the camera obscura, which is the metaphor that Marx used to describe commodity fetishes. How do we hang on to keeping that switch one way or another? And should we settle for sometimes having it switched one way, but where maybe good things are happening, people are doing good, but is that sufficient, as it were? Sorry, a slightly equivocal answer to your interesting question.
And the question in the room, please.
Thanks, Hartley. This was truly a roller coaster. I felt that my brain was stretched in many directions. It has still not quite made sense, but I'm hoping that 30 years in public service might eventually. My question to you is with regards to the notion of altruism and how it is very arbitrary when we as individuals feel altruistic. And bringing that or aggregating it up or down to a collective level in a society, is that a function of how well-to-do that society is? Will a society with deprivation be as altruistic in the same way with regards to collective action that a well-to-do society would feel? And then there are these different pulls and pushes in a deprived society, a society with less means, where what we want collectively are at so many different levels that we can't really feel collectively about anything, because the struggles are so real in the day-to-day living. And I'm completely with you in how synthetic it felt during the pandemic, or how synthetic it feels right now with regards to Ukraine. Yes, the Ukrainian media has done a fantastic job of invoking an emotion, but that's mostly in the global West. Not really sure that the global South feels the same way about it, because the global West does not seem to feel the same way about the global South. Then we have refugee crisis in, I don't know, Rwanda or Yemen. We don't invoke the same reaction. So I wonder if this switch that you're talking about is also synthetic, because we do not actually feel the same way about human beings.
No, that's a perceptive comment. You started by saying you're struggling to make sense of this. Well, so am I. I said this was a think piece. I'm trying to make sense of this. But yes, in a well-to-do society, there is plenty of scope for all this. And applying this perspective in the context of the global South it's not even a working hand at the moment. It's something with which I think one really does have to actually struggle to engage. So that was a helpful comment. Thank you.
Yeah. Go for it.
So I'm thinking about the complete, how complex interdependency might be, and that might be just that for us humans, it's easier to reach the point of altruistic behavior than to reach the point of interdependent behavior. And you mentioned a lot about how we, as humans, yearn for connection, for engaging with others, but we also yearn for uniqueness, distinctiveness, and independence. So I think reconciliating these two needs is very complicated, and that it might require like a very high level of psychological development to reconcile it in a way in which is like it's good enough to make it work as a society. And I mean, I'm thinking about theories about psychological development that say that it's actually to reach interdependent behavior, it takes at least 40, 50 years of growing to be able to understand human relationships in a way that's not only dependent or only independent.
Yes, I mean, I mentioned Michael Tomasello. I don't know if you've read any of his work. No, well, that notion of ontogenetic sociality, I can't even say it, ontogenetic. It is about the development of the human individual, how from babyhood we learn to be social creatures. And that certainly made sense to me. So I've been learning through, to produce this paper, I've been looking at a vast range of different literatures, and this is one that impressed me, because psychology is not a discipline that I've had much to do with. But this particular branch, actually, it stems out of the work of a Russian Soviet-era social psychologist, Vygotsky. Have you heard of Vygotsky? No, okay. But similarly, concerned particularly with the development of young children. And young children can be shown to be extraordinarily altruistic in certain circumstances. And they unlearn it as they mature. And they become more utilitarian, it seems. Yeah. And there are a variety of processes that is going on in that sphere. And I sort of got a mental note. I must go back and read that up a little bit more. And yes, when the paper actually comes, I mean, look up the references, because I think Vygotsky, going back a bit, actually was putting his finger, which really much had to do with the nature of the socialized individual. It is not the denial of individuality, of uniqueness. On the contrary, it is how each of us as a unique being can engage as a social being. And that's the trick. And it doesn't just happen. We learn in the course of our lives to do it. And sort of important messages, I think, in terms of policy in relation to education, as to what the relevance of education is to that, and the way in which we train workers rather than produce developed socialized individuals.
There's one hand in the left side. I can just see it a little bit, but please go. Next, the last one, then we have come to the end.
That's super helpful. It's really, a lot of us, I think, are stuck with the question of what to do to move from a situation where you have altruism to true reciprocity. So I'm sorry to say my question is kind of a variation of that same question. but it still is one that I think we're all stuck on, because is the issue that for a society to get truly towards that, you need to bring in other values, other sets of principles. It's not alone to simply say that society needs to be interdependent or recognise interdependence. So my question to you is, if that is the case, what kind of values would you need? Is there a citizenship model that you put forward, for example? And I was going to actually go back to the point on COVID as well, and Tammy's point there, because probably my view of the pandemic is even more bleak than even the one that you set out yourself, because I think what actually happened with mutual aid and support mechanisms is a few months down the line, people started to, the concept of reciprocity kind of took it. And people started to ask themselves, well, wait a minute, I'm doing this, but are other people playing by the same rules? Are other people buying up to the same concept and the same principles? And I think that, to me, at least from my perspective, is quite crucial in a lot of welfare models. And it comes back to the point on social insurance and other models as well, is that is quite critical to how a lot of people regard their place right now. So is it enough to simply say, and to simply talk about interdependence in society, or are there other values we have to think about to get us along that way? And if so, what are those, if that makes sense?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think there's probably a whole range of values which goes with that. And I've already alluded to that notion of a needs-first ethos, and a shift towards something which looks at the meeting of need rather than the realization of value. And our fetishized understanding of what is valuable is part of that, a related approach in terms of how one might wish to move. But I guess the honest answer to that question, having sort of scrambled myself to make this particular analysis, is I don't know. In a sense, that is the challenge of how to sort of realize your Gestalt switch. How do you make that work? Now, there are psychologists, again, some of them rather closely associated with the LSE, who believe in the nudge agenda. Yes, and the idea that we can suddenly somehow change people's behavior by nudging them in one direction or another. And I'll be honest, that scares me to death. I mean, in terms of, instruments of social control. But is there any sort of notion that can a nudge throw the Gestalt switch in terms of looking at it differently? Where might that take you? But in terms of saying, where's the strategy? I'm sorry, I haven't got one.
Well, thank you very much, Hartley, and everybody for contributing. I think today there was a competing event on the future of behavioral public policy, so could have been quite an interesting one to zoom that crowd into our session. Well, thank you very much, Hartley, for presenting, everybody for coming, joining either in the room, formerly known as the web room, or indeed virtually from different places. And I think we even have some people zooming in from very, very far away, the global south. So it is a great tool to increase reach when people are away, this hybrid format. Thank you very much, everybody.